Chapter 27, October 21, 1963, early morning. There's only a handful of us who know the truth. My brother's nothing but alive. Last night he drove back to Cuckoochee with Miss Gold. Now he's hiding in the Montgomery's pantry, sleeping, eating, and praying the day away, so he can be here when the trial's done. And I don't think it'll take too long. Mama says here in Cuckoochee justice is served up faster than a malted at the corner store. She doesn't expect the trial will last till noon. When we get to the courthouse, I bend down and kiss Flapjack goodbye. While my cat stretches out in a patch of sun behind the courthouse, Mom and me climb up those 7 steps and we head inside. After we take our seats in the colored rows, 12 white men settle into their seats in the jury box up front. I wish folks like Mr. Montgomery and Mrs. Jacks could be the jurors instead. But seeing as they can't pass that cockeyed test to register, I reckon Negroes will never decide our own fate in court. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I can't wait for the truth to leap out of its hiding place and give everyone a good fright. All rise, shouts the court clerk, who's still got a cold. Folks are quiet while the judge walks to his chair, bangs his hammer, and calls on the lawyer to make an opening speech. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hickok says to the jurors, I represent the great state of Mississippi. We are here this morning to do justice. As you know, a heinous crime has been committed. And I'll tell you something else. If that lawyer thinks using a big word like heinous is going to make us think he's smart, he's wrong. Good people of Cuckoochee, Mr. Hickok says, you planted a community garden for the purpose of feeding your children. But before you could harvest the crop, someone deliberately, viciously, horribly, and intentionally, I repeat, intentionally, ruined that garden by planting it over with butterbean seeds. It's clear that person intended harm, because that person didn't even set poles beside each plant so the vines could grow up the way they're supposed to. Instead, those vines grew across the garden like ivy and choked the life out of anything trying to make it on that land. Not even the butterbeans came up right. That person took food out of the mouths of your little babies, your children, and that person is here in this courtroom. It's a good thing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. isn't here in this courtroom, because I hear Dr. King doesn't like violence, and right about now I'm aching to slug Mr. Hickok's face. And I reckon Mama knows what I have in mind because she grabs my fist and holds it in her warm hand. Today, the witnesses for the prosecution will prove Bump Dawson stole the seeds from Mr. Adams' cabin and destroyed property that rightfully belongs to our community, Mr. Hickok says. Later, the Honorable Judge Cogswell will decide whether to put Bump behind bars for 5 years, or perhaps 10. Mr. Hickok turns my stomach worse than the crawfish stew. Now he rocks back on his heels. Then at long last, he sits down, his spine lean behind. Next, the judge calls on our lawyer, Miss Gold. Special for the trial, she wears a fancy blue jacket and skirt. But Mama takes one look at Miss Gold's too short headline and shakes her head. So what if her legs show? To me, Miss Gold looks fetching, kneecaps and all. Good morning, Miss Gold says to the jurors. I like how she sounds all sharp and sure like she's ready to fight. I represent the defendant, Bump Dawson, she says. As Mr. Hickok has told you, we're here today to see justice is done. To deliver justice means to do what's right and fair. Yes, someone ruined your community garden. But what's right and fair is to find the true culprit, not just a convenient scapegoat for the crime. Today, gentlemen of the jury, I will prove to you that Bump Dawson deserved nothing but your respect. This is a question of character. Not only was my client a faithful servant for more than a decade, but he's also an upright, law-abiding citizen. You'll soon see that Bump Dawson, the man sitting before you, deserves an apology for the entire community because he's not guilty of any crime. I have to stop myself from bolting to the front of the courtroom to give Miss Gold a hug. What she says, it's right and fair. And I'm sure as the sun shines, the judge will end this whole trial right now. It's clear as day. There's nothing left to discuss. So when the judge says, the case for the prosecution may begin, his words evaporate out of his mouth, condensing a cloud over my head and rain down all over me till I'm soaked to the bone. Then Mr. Hickok calls his first witness to the stand. Mama takes one look at the witness and shakes her head back and forth. And I just know that tea is spilling all over again in her mind. That's because the first witness's Uncle Bump's trial is none other than Honey's mother, the lady with the plastic strawberries on her hat, the one who flunks hardworking Negroes at voter registration, Mrs. Tate's friend, Mrs. Worth. Today, Mrs. Worth's short blonde hair is all fluffed out, and she's got on a hat, a purple box of a hat with a blue feather stuck to the side of it. While Mrs. Worth rests her plump hand on the Bible, I scrunch my toes in Daddy's dirt to let him know we need him bad, and we'd be more than grateful if anyone else in heaven could fly down and help us out too. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The court clerk asked Mrs. Worth. So help me God, she says. So very well then, says Mr. Hickok. As a most influential member of the garden club, do you know that Charles Bump Dawson has tended to the weeding and watering of the community garden, some of the most bothersome tasks in growing vegetables? That's exactly right, Mrs. Worth says. I originally thought my husband, Harold, and some of the neighborhood men were doing the job. But now I've learned Mr. Mudge hired Bump Dawson and some Negro hands to do it instead. A sweat breaks out under my dress. My armpits itch. Uncle Bump said he was working part-time mopping the floor and handing out the government cheese at the general merchandise store in Frankendale. He never said anything about tending the garden, but come to think on it, he never smells like cheese. Now I can't help but wonder, what if Uncle Bump lied? For a minute, I get stuck in this crazy thinking till I remind myself what the night said. Mrs. Worth goes on. All the evenings I thought my husband Harold was working so hard on the garden. It turns out he was out with his friends, eating and listening to music down at Roxy's. Now Harold's in big trouble, but I can assure you I will sentence him myself. The men in the front of the courtroom laugh. Oh, this is no laughing matter, Mrs. Worth says. This very same person who picked the weeds was actually the criminal who planted the seeds. The butterbean seeds, that is. The butterbean seeds that ruined our garden. And sure as God made the little green apples, Mrs. Worth points at Uncle Bump. He did it, she says. He's the one. Why would the defendant want to ruin the garden, Mr. Hickok says. Because Bump Dawson hates you and me both, Mrs. Worth says. He blames all white folks for the death of his nephew. Now, if that don't beat all, Uncle Bump doesn't blame every white Cuckoochuian for what happened to Elias, just a few creeps like Mrs. Worth's son Jimmy and his wicked friend Buck. Objection, speculation, shouts Mrs. Gold. The witness doesn't know the true feelings of the defendant and therefore cannot state the defendant's motivation. Overruled, the judge says. He bangs his hammer. Mrs. Worth pulls a tissue out of her purse and wipes each eye. Bump Dawson wanted to ruin our plans, ruin our harvest. He planted over our garden with butter beans, she said. Mrs. Worth grips the iron rail around the witness box and leans towards Uncle Bump. I want to tell her to sit back and shut her overgrown mouth, but now she's screaming. We have youngsters here who need more in their bellies, and now they're going to starve. They're going without, she grits her teeth. You want our children to starve. I'm at the end of my rope when the judge orders Uncle Bump's lawyer, Miss Gold, to begin the cross-examination. Miss Gold walks up real close to Mrs. Worth. You say Bump Dawson and some other field hands have kept up the garden all these weeks. How do you know? What do you mean, how do I know? Mrs. Worth says. Everyone knows. Mr. Mudge hired Bump to do the dirty work. After the planting, did you ever see Bump Dawson in Mr. Adams' garden? Miss Gold asks. Mrs. Worth purses her lips and bugs out of her eyes like Mrs. Gold's question is nothing short of absurd. If you think I've got time to go traipsing through the mud, you're awfully uninformed. I have 4 children to look after. I register voters at the courthouse, and I call the bingo games at church, she says. Well, you may be interested to know, Miss Gold says, Bump Dawson never worked at Mr. Adams' place after the garden planting, not even for one day. Creation, said Mrs. Worth. If that ain't a bald-faced lie, everyone knows Mr. Mudge hired a few of the colors to tend to the garden, Bump Dawson included. And you know the names of the other field hands, Miss Gold asks? Their names? Colored names? Mrs. Worth puts her hand to her chest and chuckles. I don't know their names. Then you were telling me, Mrs. Worth, that the one and only field hand you can identify happens to belong to the very same family as the boy who broke your son's leg and ruined your son's chance of getting a football scholarship to college, asked Miss Gold. Mrs. Worth scrunches her upturned nose. One matter's got nothing to do with the other, she says, and scowls. Bump Dawson oversaw that land before Mr. Adams died, and he continued to do the job after Mr. Adams died. If you want the names of the other field hands who tended the garden, I'm sure Mr. Mudge would be happy to supply them. Of course, he left town after the garden was laid by. Between opening his new shop in Muscatine County and tending his sick mama in Florida, he's been gone from Cuckoochoo for weeks. And I reckon I can't wait to let the cat out of the bag. But it doesn't much matter who the other field hands are, Mrs. Worth said, because we've got the head of all the field hands right here, the boss of the coloreds, the one in charge of what they did. Mrs. Gold holds her chin in her hand, taps her finger against it. If Bump Dawson actually did commit this crime, how do you suppose he got access to so many butterbean seeds? Wouldn't that be next to impossible for a man of his means? Mrs. Worth takes a deep breath in her nostrils. I can see you're missing some critical information, so allow me to supply it, she says. Then Mrs. Worth talks real slow, like Mrs. Gold's got a silo of wheat between your ears. I was inside Mr. Adams' garden cabin on the day of the planting, she says. I can tell you it was jam-packed with a wide variety of seed, more than we could ever use. I'm sure there was plenty of butterbean seeds there, too, enough for Bump Dawson to destroy our garden. To Mrs. Worth, everything's clear as raindrops. Once Mr. Mudge hired Bump to keep up the garden, Bump had plenty of time to break into the garden cabin, haul out the butterbean seeds, and commit this crime, she says. So if you follow me now, there isn't anyone else it could be. Mrs. Gold stands still as a charred hog in a roasting spit. I wonder if she's changed her mind. Does she think Uncle Bump did it? I'm afraid any minute now she'll quit our case and march out the courthouse door. No further questions, Miss Gold mumbles. At long last, Uncle Bump turns to face the viewing gallery. Through his blue uniform, I can make out the bones of his elbows and knees. Sweat runs down like sap down his forehead, and I know he's searching the rows for Mom and me. For a second, I can't help but wonder whether the broken-down look on his face, the dead look in his eyes, is guilt. His eyes find mine. I hope he can't see me cry. Next, Mr. Hickok calls Mr. Tate to the stand. After Mr. Tate swears in the Bible, Mr. Hickok asks him how many butterbean seeds it would take to cover Mr. Adams' field. To cover it thickly, you would need 58 pounds of seed per acre, so 6 acres would require exactly 348 pounds of seed, Mr. Tate says. And I can't believe someone so stupid can do butterbean math in his head. Now, how big is Mr. Adams' garden, Mr. Hickok asks. Well, about the size of 5 football fields, Mr. Tate says. Speaking of football, Mr. Tate, the record shows that back in high school you brought the Cuckoochoo Kickers to the state championships 4 consecutive years. I've always wanted to ask, how'd you do it? Irrelevant, Miss Gold shouts, but the judge overrules her. Then Mr. Tate spends forever boasting about how he used to be the best football player in the history of Pigskin. And I don't need to look at Mama to know she thinks Mr. Tate would do better humbling himself before the Almighty than bragging before the court. At long last, it's Miss Gold's turn to cross-examine the witness. Standing beside the muscly Mr. Tate, Miss Gold looks scrawny, but she makes up for it by scaring him a bit. She points a finger at Mr. Tate and waves it in front of his face. Then she pauses beside the witness box, one hand on her hip. You and some of the other gentlemen in Cuckoochoo told your wives you were weeding and watering when all along you were down at Roxy's, Miss Gold asks. Mr. Tate looks at the floor. Correct, he says. Please tell the court why you abandoned your responsibilities at the garden. It's simple, really. The first time we showed up at the garden to do our job, we ran into Sam Mudge at the gate. Sam tells us tending is Negro work. Says we shouldn't let our wives talk us into doing it. So he'd rather pay his own money to hire Bump Dawson and a few field hands to do the job instead of watch humiliate ourselves. But since our wives wasn't expecting us home anyway, Sam suggests we go hear Thelma Peacock sing the blues at Roxy, he says. The first night Sam brought our meal. We had a mighty fine time, so the next evening when our wives thought we was working down at the garden, we went to Roxy's again. That night, if I recall, Mad Johnny was blowing his saxophone like a crazy fool. Soon it just became, well, habit. I see, says Miss Gold. So all those evenings you were supposed to be tending the garden, you were listening to the blues down at Roxy's and munching fried catfish. Miss Gold doesn't look amused. Tell me this. Are you the biggest seed salesman in Thunder Creek County, she asks. Mr. Tate stands in the witness box, holds both hands on his potbelly. Am now, he says. Then he laughs along with the audience in the white rose and sits back down. Miss Gold plants her face up to Mr. Tate's till his smile gets erased. Seriously, he says, I'm the most successful seed salesman in Thunder Creek County. Then please tell the court whether you sold any large quantity of butter beans this year, Miss Gold says. Well, there are 923 butter bean seeds per pound, so let me think. I sold 321,204 seeds. I hate the way Mr. Tate talks all polite like it comes natural, when at home he's nothing but a tobacco-spitting low. And how fast do your butter bean vines grow, she asks. The particular variety I sell grows at an alarming rate, 10 inches a week. Miss Gold struts back to her seat, opens her suitcase, and removes a green rope. She orders Mr. Tate to hold one end of the jump rope while it stretches across the front of the courtroom. Then she asks the bailiff to measure it with a measuring tape. The bailiff says the jump rope is exactly 6 feet long. For the record, Miss Gold says, this butterbean vine was clipped from Mr. Adams' field just yesterday. And that's when I found out it isn't jump rope at all. Now then, Mr. Tate, do we agree that if a vine grows 10 inches per week, then at 6 feet or 72 inches, this vine has been growing 7 weeks? Miss Gold asks. Irrelevant, yells Mr. Hickok. What does that have to do with anything? Sustained, says the judge. Well then, Miss Gold said, let me ask you this, Mr. Tate. To whom did you sell the 321,204 butterbean seeds? Even from back here, I can see the sweat bubble up on Mr. Tate's forehead. Well, I sold them to Mr. Adams before he died, and Bump Dawson stole them. Speculation, Miss Gold says. Overruled, says the judge. And how do you keep track of your sales? Miss Gold asks. Records, Mr. Tate says. He folds his arms across his chest. And with your records, Miss Gold says, I imagine it would be quite simple for you to prove to the court you sold the butterbean seeds to Mr. Adams, the very seeds you allege were then stolen by Bump Dawson to plant over the garden. Mr. Tate nods. Then, Judge, I would like to request that the witness please retrieve his records so that we can admit them as evidence, Miss Gold says. But then Mr. Tate changes his mind. He tells Miss Gold he doesn't have time to keep track of each little sale, and even if he did, he wouldn't be able to get his records because they're in the bedroom where his wife's sleeping. She was up all night with the baby. You're a lady, Mr. Tate says to Miss Gold. I shouldn't have to tell you how hard it is to have a baby and your help up and gone to a trial. Mom and me, we'd chew up our tongues, and I know if we could, we'd spit them into his beastly face. Now Mr. Tate's forehead drips like he's hiding something, and I start to wonder what it is. And I reckon Miss Gold wonders too, because when she turns to the judge, she looks like my cat does just before he pounces on a field mouse. Your Honor, she says, I request we stop this trial until the records have been subpoenaed and both parties have had the opportunity to review them. I would like them taken from the witness's bedroom immediately. Go on now, fetch the records, the judge tells Mr. Tate. No hurry, he adds and winks. Then Miss Gold looks at the judge the same way I look at Flapjack after he's dragged a dead mouse in the kitchen.